Thank you for joining us. My name is Joseph Harris. I'm the director of the Global Health Politics Workshop, and it is my terrific pleasure today to introduce my friend, Mahatma Gandhi, Associate Professor of Political Science and International and Public Affairs at Brown University. She is the president of the Comparative Politics section of the American Political Science Association, and she is going to share with us today some thoughts about her wonderful project, Comparative, of course, on vaccination in India and China.
Thank you so much to all of you here in the room for coming, and to all of you on Zoom for being there. And thank you, Joe, for inviting me. Thank you for making this space possible, online and in person. I was telling Joe when we were walking over that I've only been previously online, so it's great to actually see this room. For those of you who haven't, it's very nice, and it's a great lunch, and I hope that we can all see each other in person at some point. So what I'll be sharing today are really thoughts around an ongoing book project, going for longer than I would like, but hopefully in the concluding stages now, which is tentatively called Moral Morale, and it is about the history of vaccination morale in 19th century China and India. And because it is still very much in the process of really being drastically edited and rewritten, I would really appreciate all your comments, and they would come at a particularly great time for me in terms of the evolution of the project. So, COVID has been a grim but stark reminder of the specter of infectious disease. It has been historically the single largest cause of human mortality. And by the accounts of many medical historians, it is infectious diseases that have claimed more lives than wars, natural disasters, as well as non-communicable diseases combined. And as a political scientist, of course, I was struck when I began reading about it, just how critically disease had shaped the course of our history, the course of wars, military expeditions from Alexander to Napoleon, the decline of empires from the Holy Roman to many other empires, as well as, of course, the success of revolutions. So again, a kind of fun fact that I learned was that in large part, the Haitian Revolution was enabled by the fact that a number of the enslaved people had developed resistance to yellow fever in the way that the French had not. And so economic consequences, of course, we see it around us with COVID, but even before with a number of other diseases. And of course, a famous article in Social Science by Darren Acemoglu and Jim Robinson, which talks about how disease, which in turn influenced settler mortality, had long-run consequences for the institutions in a state, which in turn influenced political and economic consequences. So the 20th century has seen landmark advances in the way in which we treat infectious diseases. And in some ways, our understanding of disease has increased more in the last century than in the previous 40 centuries combined. And this has led to an epidemiological transition in which life expectancy has increased, infant mortality has decreased. And in some ways, this kind of created this hubris back in the 60s and 70s, in the heydays of the kinds of, antibiotics, vaccines, that in a way, infectious diseases would be conquered. But of course, we know that that was a hubris that was actually most tragically and starkly pierced by the arrival of the HIV/AIDS epidemic. And we know today that vector-borne diseases are going to be with us. And in some ways, the pathogens are going to continue to evolve as are treatments for them. And so they continue to pose political challenges. I think of the AIDS epidemic and the challenges posed to democratic consolidation in Africa, to China's zero COVID policies and the protests against this, but also increasingly infectious diseases are securitized as potential agents of bioterrorism. And before COVID, and this project began long before COVID, I used to try to talk about the dread of disease as mirrored in popular culture. And so when I was putting together these slides, I found this old slide that almost seemed like kind of tragic comic to me, in that, I needed to kind of put up these, what I called the greatest hits of epidemic infection horror, to be able to motivate the problem of why looking at infectious diseases was worthwhile, especially for a political scientist. So in some ways, when we think of this specter of infectious diseases, it has to do because of these deadly consequences. But it also has to do because of this kind of chilling, silent, mode of transmission. The fact, and it's become even more with globalization, the fact that disease does not respect borders, and yet borders structure our vulnerability to disease. And this, I think, is really the central puzzle of this project, which is that even as diseases kind of pass across tightly policed borders, where in the world we find ourselves influences how vulnerable we are to the same disease. And so the question then becomes, why do places with shared epidemiological demographic and socioeconomic conditions differ in the way that they've controlled contagion? And, COVID is actually a nice laboratory to be able to see why this matters when we think of the success of certain countries, whether it's Senegal and Rwanda as compared to other African lower income countries, of Vietnam compared to other middle income countries, and of countries like New Zealand, which have far outperformed countries in that kind of similar category of advanced industrialized countries. So what I'll do very quickly today is just kind of specify the research question a little more, talk about my case selection, which is the title tells you is kind of 19th and 20th century China and India. I'll talk a little about the theoretical framework of moral vaccination, and then hopefully have time to at least talk you through a few of the empirics as they relate to one or if possible two of the empirical chapters, and conclude hopefully with some implications for kind of public health today, but I'm very much looking forward to the conversation. So to me, states are these key actors in the control of contagion. And there is an article by an economist called Easterlin who kind of compares the role of the markets to the role of the states over the last 100 years and talks about how it is really states that have been the key actors. And the control of contagion has not just been within the domain of states, it's actually in some ways what has led to the building of states in the first place. So in political science, Charles Tilley, who's one of our kind of great thinkers, has this dictum about the Bellicist theory of war, of how it is war that makes states. And so in some ways, I'm trying to modify that by saying it's as much war against disease that has made states in terms of the control of contagion as having been ground zero for the building of state institutions, both institutions of control, and we can think here of how the arrival of the plague and repeated epidemics of the plague led to the development of institutions of law enforcement, police and customs, of surveillance, of quarantines, of health bureaucracy, that it was really this kind of impetus to control epidemics that led to the kind of development of these institutions, as well as what we might call institutions of care. And here I'm thinking about, things like the sanitation revolution, the building of infrastructure, not just in England, but across much of Europe, as well as poor laws and policies that provided relief for the needy in times of disease, but really in response to kind of poor health more broadly. So the control of disease and healthcare in terms of this kind of trajectory of the building of states then gradually goes from being recognized as within the jurisdiction of states to actually being a key responsibility of states towards their people, such that in the 1930s, FDR is saying that actually he's making a case for state capacity to be seen in terms of the capacity of a state and the responsibility of a state to provide health to its people. So he says the state's paramount concern should be the health of its people. Nothing can be more important to a state than its public health. So of course, this has to be seen in the context in which he's speaking, but it is, I think, a kind of very strong endorsement of how it is that the state responsibility in public health came to be cemented. So today we're, in this age of globalization, of the Gates Foundation, and of many other international non-state actors that are playing an increasingly important role. Anne Swidler, who gave a terrific talk a few weeks ago, spoke explicitly about the role of non-state actors in the control of HIV/AIDS in Africa. But of course, we see this along with the continued importance of domestic non-state actors. And Melanie Cammett, who's on the board here that Joe's put together, of course, has a book about the role of sectarian actors and how they provide healthcare across the Middle East. But I argue that despite this kind of role of non-state actors, both international and domestic, states even today remain the key players in the control of contagion. And you can see that even in COVID. So there was a worldwide survey in terms, I think actually not worldwide, mostly Western Europe, in which in Western Europe, people were asked, who do you think should be the key actor responding to COVID? And overwhelmingly, it was national governments. States expected their national governments to be the primary actors responding to this global pandemic. And in many ways across social science, whether you go back to Amartya Sen's kind of, famous human development indicators, as well as other indicators, you see how the control of disease is often a proxy in indicators both of development, of a state's development, as well as state capacity. And so this is all to say that I really rephrase and zero in on this question of trying to understand why is it that states vary in their capacities to control infectious diseases. And this question of the state's control of infectious diseases, for the fact that it is so important, actually is remarkably understudied in political science and sociology. And many people in this Zoom room are kind of exceptions to what I think is a kind of real lacuna in political science. And so what explains why is it that states have differing abilities, differing responses to the control of contagion? In some ways, we can think of the identity of disease. I find this a particularly generative way of thinking about it. Rosemary Taylor, who again is on the steering committee, has spoken about how the identity of a disease, tuberculosis versus, for instance, a stigmatized sexually transmitted disease. And this goes back to work by Terence Ranger and Paul Slack about how the constructions of what a disease is, who is influenced by it, influences the way in which a state will respond to it. We can think of regime type, the work of Peter Baldwin, the idea that democracies do better. But if you kind of go beyond that, it really seems as if much of the scholarship has focused disproportionately on AIDS. And within that, really on one region of the world, which is Africa. And here we have great work that has spoken about the role of elites in countering HIV/AIDS, political elites, Kim Dion's work on executive time horizons, Jeremy Luder's work, again, on the identities of the kind of post-apartheid South African elite and the counter-epistemic community. Also the role of bureaucrats, so kind of elites beyond political elites in the work of Joe Harris. And, I can talk a lot more. Kevin's done a lot of work in terms of the explicit control, Kevin Croak at Harvard, in terms of the explicit control of contagion. But in a way, a kind of book-length study of this is Evan Lieberman, who I worked with who was on my dissertation committee, who's written about the differential control of HIV/AIDS across Brazil, South Africa, and India. And he talks about constructions of risk as they're reflected in boundary institutions. So if we kind of move now away from political science's examination of the study of the control of contagion to the broader question of, okay, the control of contagion is related to kind of overall state infrastructure for health. And so here we have a much larger scholarship across political science and sociology that again talks about a range of factors that might influence when and why states prioritize health policy more broadly. So the provision of health services, the number of doctors, clinics, and, a lot of these have focused on levels of economic development, regime type, institutional structures, political competition, class mobilization, social movements, again, the role of bureaucrats. And my own previous work has looked at how solidarity and ideas of community and cohesiveness can influence whether or not states prioritize social welfare. But the question, the thing that you kind of see again and again, I recently read a great article by Kevin Croak at Harvard, also in the context of Ethiopia and the kind of recent health reforms in Ethiopia. But across this entire scholarship, whether it's looking at infectious disease or it's looking at health policy more broadly, I was struck by the fact that a majority of the work seems to focus on these top-down dynamics of the institution of policies. When and how policies get made, when do they get onto the books? When is it that states commit to the control of contagion? When are they more likely to look away, as in the case of, for instance, South Africa and AIDS? And so what I want to say is that, the kind of provision of these policies, these state these top-down dynamics are a necessary condition, but they're not the entire story. And in some ways, this is going to be the focus of the book, and it's brought out most clearly this kind of importance of focusing on the bottom-up dynamic by looking at vaccine hesitancy, which you see, of course, in the US with COVID, but before COVID and beyond the US in 2019. So just on the precipice of the pandemic, the WHO had listed vaccine hesitancy as one of its top 10 threats to global health. And these are contemporary vaccination rates. You can still see in parts of the US how low they are, but we are still way short of herd immunity. And also beyond COVID, if you kind of go back to 2019 and you think of the measles outbreaks in Disneyland and across many parts of the US, as well as across Europe, and the fact that we have been on the cusp, but unable to eradicate polio across the world. And you keep seeing these kind of, renewed episodes of polio. It gets to me, this question of how important this question of popular compliance is when we are trying to understand the question of the control of contagion. So again, just to kind of very quickly, so the question then is, why do states vary in their capacity to gain the compliance of their citizens with public health policies? And I'll be focusing in particular on vaccination, which of course has been hailed as a single most intervention in public health in terms of lives saved, and particularly for children, because it is immunization against infectious diseases that has protected especially children, but also adults from untimely death than any other form of treatment. So why is it that states vary in their capacity to gain their compliance with vaccination policies? And I will look at this question in the context of the world's first vaccine, which targeted what is by many accounts the deadliest human disease to afflict us, which is smallpox. It's also the oldest. And this is a mummy of Ramesses V, which is usually considered the earliest documented or material evidence of smallpox. But not only was it one of the deadliest, it is the only human disease that we have been able to eradicate and is as such considered a triumphant achievement in medicine and public health. This was the result of a WHO campaign during the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So we have, as a political scientist, it's a particularly nice, tapestry in which to structure, because you have a clear beginning point, which is the invention of the vaccine, which I'll talk about briefly, and the eradication of the disease. And so these are the kind of temporal markers within which the study is situated. So in particular, I look at China and India. There are many reasons to do this, and I'll kind of rush through this pretty quickly. Large kind of multi-ethnic countries, demographically and ethnically extremely diverse, but in terms of the history of smallpox, very similar. So they to me are a kind of, again, nice way of thinking about it. In kind of colonial historiography, they're often, the moniker cradles of smallpox is often used to describe China and India, in that they are definitely have some of the earliest recorded history of smallpox epidemics, continued to have regular epidemics into the 19th century. And the theory of causation of smallpox was very similar in terms of being caused by a smallpox goddess, To Shen Nyanang, in China, and the Sitala Ma, and these are representations. I could show you thousands more. It's been a cottage industry of collecting these images. But both were, both the cause of the disease, but also prayer to them, worship of them, propitiation of them was also a way to kind of gain the pleasure of the goddess and recover from it. Most critically, they were accompanied by very similar traditional ways, dietary rules in particular, and kind of prohibitions around the disease, and also seasonality. In both, it was considered to be a disease of the spring, and that becomes important when we think about the impediments to vaccination later, which I'm not sure I'll have a chance to get into, but I'm happy to talk about. Most critically, and this I'll just spend a minute around, is that they both had well-established traditions by the 16th century of the prophylactic practice of variolation. So I'll just take a minute because I can't actually see. I would, if our audience was all in person, I would kind of see a show of hands to see how much I should go into this. But the logic, so when you think of a vaccine, the logic is that, at least in the traditional vaccines, the logic was that you were given a very controlled dose of the germ in order for you to kind of develop immunity to the pathogen so that when you encountered it in the wild, you were less likely to be affected by it because you had already developed immunity to this particular pathogen. Now, this logic and this mechanism through which a vaccine works is the same mechanism that originated in the practice of variolation. And the key difference, of course, was that in variolation, you were using the actual disease pathogens themselves. And so I won't tell you a story of how in the early days of the pandemic, I heard of people, I don't know if you heard of these people, but there was a New York Times article about these people who wanted to go out and get COVID because they wanted to develop immunity to it. That was the practice of variolation, but even in the 16th century, they were doing this in a far more sophisticated and controlled way in China and India. So the idea was that if, Joe got a case of smallpox, in this case, the pustules, which is where the germs were contained, would be taken, dried, attenuated in efficacy over the course of at least a season or two, and then a trained practitioner, a variolator, would take this and administer it to young children so that they would not contract smallpox when the epidemics came around. And this happened in China mostly, but not only, through the process of nasal insufflation. So our nasal membrane is, I don't know, way back when I was in grad school, we were given the option of taking the flu vaccine around through our nose. Somehow I haven't been offered that lately. But, it's kind of like, it was either blown through a pipe or, you almost like just kind of snorted it like cocaine or, and in India, it was very similar to what you would think of as a contemporary vaccine. It was an incision made usually into the top of your arm with the actual powder. But you'll see why I've kind of gone into this in a little bit more detail when we get to the question of the vaccine. So the key thing to remember is that both China and India had well-established practices of variolation against smallpox by the 16th century. This is then taken to the West by a very brave lady. I just want to make a plug for womenyoushouldknow.net, which has this great cartoon about this woman who was quite brave and courageous and was really suffered a lot of social rebuke when she decided to get her daughters in particular, because she herself had been really deformed by smallpox, because the idea was if you didn't die from it, it either rendered you blind or your face was this kind of lunar pockmarked landscape because you were disfigured, deformed by it. And so she brought smallpox to the West, then to England. It spread to other parts of Europe, and it led to massive decreases in mortality from smallpox. Comes Edward Jenner, usually credited with being the, quote, inventor of the world's first vaccine, and his kind of, in a way, modification or value added to variolation. He himself was variolated as a child. But what he discovered was that cowpox maidens were some of the most beautiful and desirable women in England at the time. And the reason was because they contracted cowpox, a disease that sounds quite nasty if you were a cow, but not very nasty if you were a human. And but because they got cowpox, they were immune to smallpox. And so what he did was, rather than taking the scabs of the smallpox, the smallpox victims, he began to take cowpox scabs. And the big thing was because, even if you were variolated with the smallpox scab, say I was variolated with Joe's smallpox scabs, I would still be contagious. So every once in a while, epidemics were triggered and things could go wrong, and I could get a really bad case of smallpox, while here you were being vaccinated with a very benign virus for humans, which was cowpox. And this then leads to the term variola vaccinae, which means vaccination of the cow, the cowpox, and it gives rise to the term vaccines itself. And that is the origin of it. The reason why I put these two posters side by side is because the origins of the vaccine are accompanied almost simultaneously by an anti-vaccine movement. And so the poster here is talking about, you see those people who have developed hooves and horns, and the idea would be that this vaccine from the cow was going to lead you to erupt into bovine features, and this was a rupture with nature and against the will of God. Remarkably similar arguments to some that you kind of see in the general kind of social media sphere today. So, okay, very quickly, I look at this temporal time period. And I start in 1805, which is the exact point in time when the smallpox vaccine arrives in both China and India via the same actor, the British East India Company. And that's a kind of convenient starting point for me. And then I look at, in the book is structured around 3 sets of empirical comparisons, cities across China and India, provinces within colonial India, and a cross-national comparison of China and India in the 50s and up until the 70s, to try to kind of understand this question of how it is that the smallpox vaccine is more likely to be adopted in certain cases as compared to others. And in particular, so I won't get into that much more, except to kind of quickly talk you through the theoretical framework. So state capacity, broadly speaking, is a very fertile, fecund topic of research in political science and in sociology. And I argue that thinking about a state's capacity to control disease in terms of its compliance capacity is an important contribution to scholarship on state capacity, because actually, if you look under the hood of some of the most influential ways of thinking about state capacity, they really are about compliance. So one important way that state capacity has been conceptualized is in terms of fiscal or extractive capacity, which usually refers to a state's ability to get people to basically pay their taxes, which is a leading source of revenue for states. And so this too is critically about compliance. And it has been thought about as such when a number of political scientists have thought of taxation as a collective action problem. The best thing for you, for your taxes, much like in vaccines, is to free ride. You don't want to kind of pay your taxes. You don't want to take even that minuscule risk of having a vaccine side effect reaction, but you want to kind of, free ride on herd immunity and everyone else paying their taxes and you're getting piped water and a solid pavement to walk on, right? Popular compliance is also at the core of a number of adjacent concepts, or concepts that you might even think of as part of state capacity. The idea of stateness, put forward by John Gehring, who used to be in the BU Political Science Department, and Daniel Ziblatt, the kind of key issue of infrastructural power by Michael Mann, and also social control by Joel Migdal. And I'm happy to talk about each of these and how I think my argument fits. So, and within sociology and political science, there's been a lot of work that talks about variation in state capacities, the fact that we can't really talk about capacity in a singular way. And actually, within a single state, the capacity of states really vary, across their territorial reach, between urban areas and rural areas. My own work has looked at provinces in India and how they vary in terms of their control of infectious diseases and health, but also this idea that we can have pockets of effectiveness, certain bureaucracies, Erin McDonald's work, that can do really well as compared to others. And so I argue that when you kind of move away from those axes to then looking about compliance, this is just a kind of way to conceptualize it. So on the x-axis, we can think of those tasks that require popular inputs and compliance. And on the y-axis are the level of technical expertise that's required, right? So up there, like, tasks like foreign policy, space policy, monetary policy, the making of public health policy, these don't really require much popular input. Therefore, they're in that kind of top left corner. Then as we kind of go down, we begin to see that you might say that the building of a road or a highway doesn't require the degree of technical expertise that, say, space policy or energy policy requires, or fiscal and monetary policy, but it does require more popular inputs. It might require, people to be resettled. It might require land acquisition. And then finally, when you get to questions of vaccination or, for instance, open defecation, even states like India, which in many ways are not considered capable states, they can put the toilets there. The toilets, in fact, that's a kind of irony, is that the Indian countryside is littered with brand new toilets, but people are still defecating outside in the fields. And so I argue that it is those set of tasks that actually don't require high-level technical expertise, but do require popular compliance that figure down there. And I argue that looking at it in this way kind of opens up a new way of thinking about variations within states and across states over time. And so you might kind of look at post-colonial India, as I just said, which does actually remarkably well. In terms of, putting satellites into space, putting astronauts into space, having quite well-developed fiscal and monetary policy, collects a variety of statistics, provides infrastructure, roads and highways, a telecom revolution, but doesn't do so well when it comes to questions, of the uptake of vaccination or questions like open defecation. And then if you look at China, you might argue that, at least in the, of course, all of this varies over time. It's a huge, huge simplification. Please push back. I'm happy to kind of, talk about this more, but it's really just an analytic heuristic. But the idea is that you can have disastrous industrial policy, the idea that the Great Leap Forward, the premise of it was that you could kind of make this Great Leap Forward by smelting iron in backyards. You might even think of the Cultural Revolution as the policy premise being quite flawed. But then when you think about the compliance of it, the compliance is remarkably high. And I'm going to lean on the work of a number of China scholars, especially a kind of recent work that shows that this is not explained by the despotic state or by coercion entirely. And so in some ways, Lily Tsai, who's at MIT, used to say that the tragedy of the Great Leap Forward was actually a tragedy of compliance. If people had not complied, if there hadn't been popular mobilization in support of the policy, you wouldn't have had the kind of degree of famine and hunger that you did. It was a remarkably successful, it was an instance of remarkable success of a terrible industrial policy. So those are the kinds of paradoxes that I think looking at compliance as the key component of state capacity allows us to look at. What is compliance? I'll quickly go over this. I think of it building on Tom Tyler and others, just as in all instances of people aligning their action with that of the state. Tyler has a kind of spectrum. He says it can be compliance, cooperation, more active engagement. It can be reactive. You wear a mask because otherwise you're going to be fined, or it can be more proactive. You can be distributing masks, you could be spreading information. So, but really in the course of this project, you'll see that I'm really kind of being able to operationalize compliance quite thinly in terms of being able to accept or not accept the vaccine. But, we can think of, again, as I said, we can think of individual and collective compliance. So individual can be just, again, wearing masks, obeying stay-at-home orders, getting vaccinated. But in terms of the proactive collective part of it, you can have mobilizations and marches in support of health workers, in support of essential services personnel. But this is just, as I said, a kind of compliance, a conceptual exercise for compliance. And then in terms of resistance, you can have individual resistance, which can be nonviolent. I will not get myself vaccinated. I will not, during, for instance, the plague epidemic and highly draconian, policies, people would conceal their patients. In India, reading the kind of colonial historiography around it, it's kind of crazy. I mean, people hiding plague patients in wardrobes, in gardens, almost tying them up to make them seem as if they're just hunched over a kitchen fire. So all of these are kind of resistances to what were quite draconian policies on the kind of, but they also took the form of protests, riots, uprisings, and attacks on healthcare workers. Again, just in terms of India, I think the first assassination of a colonial official and one of the only assassinations of a colonial official, British official in India, was the plague commissioner of Pune. And so that tells you a little bit about the intensity of the interventions in public health, but also the degree of resistance to them. I think there are, through like hundreds of years of colonial rule, I think the number of British officials assassinated is a handful. And the first and kind of in a way most famous is the plague commissioner of Pune. So how do we explain compliance capacity? We can think of this in terms of coercion. This has been the kind of historic handmaiden. I've spoken about some of the draconian legislation in colonial India. We can think of it as compulsion. Even today, a number of countries in the world made COVID vaccines compulsory and backed them with stiff fines and penalties, including imprisonment. We can think of disincentives. So, you make access to public schooling or employment contingent on a vaccine certificate. When I last presented this, I think it was the American Political Science Association, which was happening in Montreal. And the headline was that if you want either weed or wine, you get jabbed, right? So that's a kind of soft incentive. soft disincentive. You can't get stoned or drunk if you haven't got the vaccine. But all of these are instances of what we might call sticks, right, to gain compliance. They're normatively problematic because they graze uncomfortably and often violate civil liberties. They are especially bad for scapegoated minority groups. So think of, Muslims in India, Roma in Europe who were disinfected, by having disinfectant sprayed on them, and Asians across the world. These are just photographs I took in Chinatown shortly after COVID, just talking about the degree of victimization of Asian Americans in America. But also they require enormous informational capacity to monitor when people are violating it, and coercive and surveillance capacity to be able to kind of find that, right? And of course, there's massive backlash against this coercion. So in the long run, it's usually not considered the way, think of all of these as ways that we might think of backlash to coercion. And they leave a long trail of mistrust. Sarah Lowe's, who is an economist, has actually shown that in Africa, in Francophone Africa, places that had more draconian implementation of public health campaigns have a harder time with WHO public health campaigns even today. So a long trail of state society mistrust and a rupture of that relationship. Okay, so moving away from sticks, we can think about carrots, right? You're given incentives to comply. And here again, it's just striking how it tells you a little about the world we live in. Again, in Washington state, you got a joint, you could get a joint if you got vaccinated, along with fiscal incentives that varied, donuts, books, everything possible. But across much of the developing world, a number of carrots have been employed. But again, which incentives work? How effective are they? How long does the effect last? And also a growing literature that shows that the provision of these fiscal incentives actually crowd out intrinsic motivations to comply. Okay, we can give people information. You can think of that as a carrot. And yet we know that facts don't change our mind. Growing kind of, mixed results with COVID, but pre-COVID, the idea was actually giving people more information about the side effects of vaccines actually made them less likely to comply. Brendan Nyhan and a bunch of co-authors had a study in pediatrics that showed this, among others. So these you might think of all as extrinsic motivations, right? They're all forms of what might be called political control. And they all rely in various ways on this model of human behavior that assumes rationality, right? That we are going to comply because we don't want to be beaten into it, because, compliance is better than a stick. And because if we are given an incentive, we are incentivized into it. But we know now that we are not rational actors. And there's, again, a huge scholarship that shows we have cognitive biases and we are motivated reasoners. This has now led to a new set of interventions, which are usually called nudges, associated with the work of Cass Sunstein and others, which are basically that, we can be nudged back into alignment with our self-interest. I want to kind of, say, okay, but even when we think about moving away from Homo economicus, we think about compensating for under-rationality. But what happens if we actually begin by talking about how we are beyond rational, that we have affective normative motivations, that we are driven not just by narrowly defined interest maximization, cost-benefit calculation, but by emotions, values, worldviews, norms, and solidarities. And these what we might call intrinsic motivations. And I'm going to rush through this to say that the basic point that I want to kind of show through the kind of empirical evidence and that the argument that has come out is that it's not just that compliance is coerced, incentivized, or nudged, but the fact that actually compliance is given quasi-voluntarily, and it's given as an obligation. And in some senses, this harks back to a Weberian idea of legitimacy. So the basic argument is that compliance is more likely to be given when it is embedded in a moral ecology of state-society relations, and particularly if the state intervention is seen as morally authoritative. What do I mean by this? Is the intervention seen as normatively appropriate? And is it seen as affectively aligned? Why is this important? Compared to a lot of other tasks that states do, think of conscription or taxation, health, its theories, origins, and cures are rooted deeply in our spiritual and sacred realms, in our cultural life, in rituals of life, and of course, death. right? And the control of disease in healthcare has been the site of competing normative claims by a number of institutions, by individual healers, by religious organizations, in the way that the provision of law and order or taxation has not been. So to me, it makes a moral theory of compliance all the more necessary and important for the domain of public health. I'm also trying to invert the gaze by saying it's not just that, like, how, the state sees society, Jim Scott-esque, but how society sees the state. And this is a moral authority that's historically constructed, but it's also malleable. What do I mean? When a state asks you to wear a mask or to vaccinate or to wash your hands, do you think that the state has the right to do this? And is it right for the state to do this? I'll talk about this. I talk about the central state, but also the local state in terms of the frontline providers. And when I think of the intervention as being affectively aligned, I say, is the ask cognitively consonant? Does it create a cognitive rupture, or does it align with my worldview? And is it emotionally motivating? In terms of cognitive consonance, we know a lot of work that says we prefer the familiar. That Leon Festinger, who's actually a sociologist, had shown that, we need to, when we find new information, we need to link it to previous information so that it's kind of understood and incorporated. Daniel Kahneman developed this insight of what he called cognitive ease. And the diffusion of innovation literature talks about this as well, right? That naming an innovation and positioning it makes it more compatible when it is actually aligned with indigenous knowledge systems, rather than like being said, eureka, it's brand new. So if you link it to previous existing knowledge, it's more likely to be accepted. And I always think of the classic examples of the tourist brochures that were encouraging Americans to go to France to rebuild the economy after the Second World War. And they were being encouraged to kind of have more adventurous culinary experiences and to spend their money in restaurants. And they were told, you must try frog legs, they taste just like chicken legs. And this was actually a kind of sociologist who came up with this idea. There's also, in terms of affective alignment, a growing scholarship on the role of emotions. I rely on the work, particularly of Martha Nussbaum and my own colleague at Brown, Sharon Krause, but also in psychology. This is from an annual reviews article in terms of the number of papers that show how emotions affect decision-making. And of course, in neuroscience, we know this really after Damasio, just how important emotions are to the ability to make decisions. Okay, I've given you a lot, so I'm just going to very quickly say this is the 2x2 that I probably should have come to much sooner, and I apologize. So the idea is that you have the greatest likelihood of success when an intervention like a vaccine is both seen as normatively appropriate and is affectively aligned, and your greatest likelihood of failure when neither is the case. And I'm still struggling to kind of find a case in that upper right-hand box, but these are the way that the cases kind of fit. And I'll just give you like just little vignettes of how it fits for the case of Canton and Calcutta, which are the subnational paired comparison during the 19th century. And if I get a minute, I'll talk about the 1950s. This is the structure of the book. And I'll just talk about the comparison of why is it that the vaccine was taken up in Canton, but was not taken up in colonial Calcutta. There are many reasons why actually I think these two cities, I use Canton because that's the colonial term, colonial era name for it. It's Guangzhou, of course, today, Kolkata today for Calcutta, are very similar in terms of a number of epidemiological factors, very similar in terms of demographic conditions, very similar in terms of socioeconomic conditions. I love this because it's actually a very terrible, I've been told, painting, but it shows how important both cities were in terms of the British trade. Especially the opium trade began with tea, began with opium. Opium is being really grown outside Calcutta and is being shipped to Canton. But the key puzzle, of course, is that even though the vaccine comes at the same time through the same actor, you have massive uptake of vaccination in Canton and resistance in Calcutta. And I argue that this can be explained not by a lot of alternative explanations. The big one, of course, here is colonialism and the fact that vaccination was seen as a tool of empire, but really more because of the fact that it was normatively appropriate and affectively aligned. I have a whole theory of why it is that this is the case, but I won't get into it today, but I'm happy to talk about where normative authority and affective alignment comes from. But the basic point, maybe I'll just say that, so basically in Canton, the vaccination is endorsed by the gentry. I argue that the gentry, through the Confucian civil service exams, and because they have a long history of doing this, are actually, so when the gentry kind of come and endorse vaccination, which is brand new, remember variolation is old, but vaccination is not, they're seen as normatively appropriate actors to do this because they've been doing it for a very long time. And what they do, what the gentry does, is that they affectively align vaccination, mostly through writing prefaces for this one particular vaccination manual. Happy to talk about it. Spent way too much of my life reading various reprints and prefaces of this. But the basic point is that this is written by one of the first vaccinators, who was actually an employee of the East India Company. He was a personal employee of the Surgeon General. He writes this account of inducing pox, which is a vaccination manual. It's technically a translation of a manual written by Alexander Pearson, who's the Surgeon General, and that in English is called The Extraordinary History of a New Method of Inoculation Discovered in the Kingdom of England. Churchy decides that there's no need to mention that this was invented in England, so he conveniently gets rid of that. And he sinicizes this in a variety of ways. In addition to changing the title, he rewrites this in the style of a traditional Chinese medicine text. There is no theory to vaccines because Jenner's invention, and it's one of the reasons why he never really got much credit among the medical community in England. They always thought he was a bit of a quack because he didn't really know how vaccines worked. He just knew that if you give the cowpox vaccine, it'll give you immunity. So Churchy decided to add a theory. It had to do with taidu, fetal toxin, which is how vaccines had been traditionally understood. He added a number of dietary protocols and herbal formulas in order to accompany vaccination, which was how it had been previously. And he added meridian acupuncture theory to justify what was a radically new method. So remember that in China, you blew up the smallpox scabs up your nose. So the idea of an incision into the skin was very new. And so this incision, the technique, was justified by aligning it to meridian acupuncture. And so these are illustrations from one of the most commonly circulated versions of the intaglio. They actually feature in almost all the versions. And they actually say that, you must put the vaccine into particular meridian points that align with the fetal toxin theory of the vaccine, and different points for girls and different points for boys. And in a way, this kind of, you can understand just what a departure this vaccination manual is from the original, that he actually in subsequent decades is accused of plagiarism, when, of course, he, in his own account, was simply translating it. So that gives you some sense of how far this came from the original, but also the degree of affective alignment that happened in terms of making this cognitively consonant and palatable and acceptable, such that it was not actually seen as a rupture with the existing and long established indigenous medical traditions around smallpox. I'll end in a minute just by saying, it was interesting because I recently read an old article by Rosemary, which had this very interesting point that I feel wasn't mentioned enough about how people who had greater levels of nationalism, and apologies, Rosemary, if I'm kind of misinterpreting this, had better levels of health. It's an article that makes a broader point about the social determinants of health, but she talks about how people who have greater patriotic pride have better health outcomes, controlling for a range of factors. And so just to say that that's actually strangely aligned with how this empirical argument travels into the 1950s. So I'm not going to give you anything more than this, but to say that that same affective alignment that was a cognitive alignment in the imperial period in Canton was an affective alignment in terms of the very explicit use of nationalism in the 1950s in China. So smallpox was eradicated through the patriotic health campaign. So that tells you a little bit. These are some of the posters of germ warfare. It's the time of the Korean War. And vaccination, your duty to vaccinate was very much a patriotic duty. and it was embedded in this whole frame of nationalism. And so the kind of return, so this is that second box in the kind of moral authority. It's the normative alignment and it's the affective alignment. I'll end by saying I think this has implications for contemporary health. It's also a part of a project that I was describing to Joe and others in the room about a new moral economy that I have been involved with in a while, which kind of is also associated with my first book, in which it's not just about, all the, so about all those things that we don't usually think about and that I would argue are usually considered beyond rationality, that can explain compliance, but also public health outcomes and development more broadly. So I'm hoping that this can be a part of a kind of broader theory, what I'm hoping to call a moral theory of development.